Welcome back to Breaking the Line, the ECNL Podcast. You know when you've got a good guest, and that is when you bring somebody back for the second or third time, and it's always a pleasure to be joined by Dr. Drew Watson, an assistant professor in the Department of Orthopedics and Rehabilitation at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health, and a team physician for the Division of Intercollegiate Athletics. He is board certified in pediatrics and sports medicine, serves as the head team physician for Forward Madison FC, as the chief medical advisor for right here, the ECNL, and earned his U.S. Soccer A license in 2001. So like we like to say, when he's on, he's a coach too. He also directs the Watson Human Performance Laboratory, conducting research in both pediatric exercise physiology as well as injury prediction and the impacts of injuries on well-being and mental health in youth and collegiate athletes. And Dr. Drew Watson, welcome back to the ECNL Podcast.
Dean, it's always great to talk with you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on again.
Well, and you heard the inflection on mental health because you presented today at the symposium, which I believe is the most heavily attended symposium in the history of the ECNL. You've been around long enough to confirm that. This seems really well attended for one, right?
Yeah, this is a tremendous event. This is really the first time that I've been able to be here, and the crowd was huge, but really just the content is fantastic. The scene here is really great. The overall experience is just really impressive.
And that includes your content because, again, your topic, injuries influence mental health, and then you dove into well-being and sleep, and sometimes just simple things like that. Well-being and sleep are so important, but at the end, really tying back to this mental health epidemic that certainly was lit even with further furor because of the pandemic for sure. So let's dive in. Not everybody was here. Obviously, this is for all of the ECNL membership. So give us the key talking points in your presentation, injuries influence mental health.
Yeah, so the first part of the talk was really kind of highlighting some of the work that we'd done collaboratively with one of the ECNL clubs over the course of 3 years to look at different risk factors for injury. And the big take-home was that all we really did was ask them every day about their sleep, their mood, their stress, their soreness, and their fatigue, collected their training load every day, and looked at injuries over the course of that 3-year period. And what really stood out was that things like mood are a tremendously powerful predictor of injuries. That even separate from things like training load, when players come in with impaired well-being, they're much more likely to get injured. When players come in without having slept well, they're much more likely to get injured. And we sort of walked through the ways that we've been aggregating this data and implementing it within that club setting to reduce the risk of injury. And what we found over that 3 years, when we were using that information to guide the training for that club, we cut our injuries in half to about a third of sort of the typical injury rate that we'd see in female soccer athletes. So the big take home for me was really that we have a lot of available information to help guide player performance and reduce the risk of injury by simply asking them, how much are they training, how are they feeling, how much are they sleeping, and then using that to be prescriptive about their training week to week.
You may have just answered my next question, but I'm going to go ahead and say it again. How did you know that you cut it in half?
Yeah, so really what we did was collect data for the first year and try and get a sense of how these different risk factors react, interrelated with each other and influenced injury risk. And then over years 2 and 3, we basically looked at each age group within the club week by week. And at the start of the week, we would look at their sleep, look at their well-being, look at their prior week training load, and make kind of broad recommendations about how each group was doing. So that might mean that the 17s were looking particularly fatigued or stressed, and this might be a week that we go a little light. The 15s, on the other hand, are looking really fresh, and they could maybe go a little harder. And we looked at the injury rate that they had over the 3 years, and by the time we got to year 3, it had reduced in half compared to that first year where we just collected the data.
Okay, so real information. When you talk about well-being and sleep, in your study or just in your own expertise as somebody who's got this incredible resume that I just rattled off, what are the most solid indicators on why somebody's well-being or sleep is not where it needs to be?
Yeah, I think this is such an important point, and one of the things that we really tried to drive home today is that there are a lot of things we affect about young soccer players' lives as their coaches and as their soccer clubs, but there are a lot of things that go into their lives that are totally separate from soccer. There are academic loads, there are family stresses, there are financial stresses. All of those things can affect their well-being as well. And the only way we know whether they're in a good position or in a bad spot is if we collect the information from them. So asking them about their well-being and asking them about their sleep can give us a better sense of how things are going for them overall, not just kind of relying on our expectations from what we've been doing within a soccer context. Because if we think that poor sleep and poor mood are going to be big risk factors for injury for soccer athletes, those are going to be just as much a function of what's going on in the rest of their lives as it is a function of what's going on in their soccer life. But we wouldn't know unless we asked. And so collecting this relatively, low cost and scalable sorts of data collection to get that kind of information, that really affords us an opportunity to have a better picture of where our players stand so that we can intervene to reduce the risk of injury.
We're here with Dr. Drew Watson. Before we came on the air, you told me that the smartphone started in 2007, and it's interesting as we live our daily lives. It's a lot about perspective, and everybody at the end of the day, most important is yourself, right? And then everybody else kind of gets the benefit with your family and that type of thing. But 2007 was kind of a big year for me because that's when the Big Ten Network launched. So I didn't realize that was the same time the smartphone is. And my point is, from 2007 to now, I gotta believe it's mind-blowing the mental health epidemic and what that graph looks like. This is a podcast. We do have the benefit of some video here, but can you kind of paint the picture of the difference between 2007 when you first noticed it because of, quote, social media or smartphone, and it wasn't really even social media then, right, to where we are now?
Yeah. I mean, it's always really hard to sort of pinpoint true causal relationships. I mean, what you can say is that among adolescents and young adults in this country, suicide rates started rising steadily in 2007. Between 2007 and 2017, suicide rates doubled in high school girls. And what's really unnerving is that they tripled among 10 to 14-year-olds. Now, it's hard to say specifically this is due to social media or the advent of smartphones. Those things were sort of evolving around the same time. But what we do know is that COVID has really exacerbated this. About a year ago, we saw the American Academies of Pediatrics and the American Academies of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry declare a national children's mental health crisis based on rising emergency department visits for suicide attempts and mental health emergencies. So we recognize that on top of an existing prior mental health epidemic, COVID really sort of doubled down on that. And as much as I will be the first person to say that I think sports are extraordinarily beneficial for mental health, athletes aren't really exempt from this mental health epidemic. They're suffering as well. And we saw this in our work early in COVID when we were hearing that about 40% of our athletes were experiencing moderate to severe levels of anxiety and depression in the early COVID shutdown. Some of that has improved as we've been able to return to sports, but we're still seeing levels of anxiety and depression that are higher than they were historically, and I think this is really going to continue to be a big priority, not just among athletes, but among children in general for years and years to come.
So actionable items to help to slow down that curve of this mental health epidemic. Do you have some you can share?
Yeah, I mean, some of the things that we talked about today were ways that specifically within soccer organizations, they can start to normalize conversations around mental health. Perhaps the biggest barrier that we have to taking care of kids with mental health issues is the pervasive stigma in our culture that just makes it more difficult for them to come forward and seek care. So we talked about ways to have conversations with players where we just normalize this. Individually or as groups, we can come together and just like we talk about whether athletes are sore or fatigued, we can talk about whether they're stressed or whether they're anxious, and we can make it so that the people they interact with through soccer can be individuals they can go to have conversations about it. We talked about ways that clubs can develop relationships with community mental health resources. For example, clubs often have relationships with a physical therapist or physical therapy office or even a sports medicine organization.
Always.
in the same way, they can set up relationships with a community sports psychologist. I guarantee in every community that these clubs are coming from, there is one of those who would love to have that relationship with a club.
Brilliant and necessary, right?
Yeah, it brings them business, and it is exactly the type of person that they want to interact with, are young athletes who are really looking to address the underlying issues to help them get better. That allows coaches to be a place that players can come, but that they can quickly plug them in to an available resource so that they don't feel like they have to serve as their mental health provider. They can just be someone who can connect them with the resources so that they can get help in a way that allows players to maybe more easily access it than they otherwise would.
And as far as you know, do you know if ECNL member clubs are putting that into place, or at least trying to?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, I've had a few conversations here specifically about that, and I think it's a relatively novel idea. I mean, it is only recently that clubs have started to have these relationships with physical therapy and sports medicine offices, recognizing that that can reduce barriers to access. We certainly talked about it a lot today, and individually I'm having the same conversation with folks kind of one-on-one, so I'm hoping that it becomes more of a standard practice now that we can recognize what a big need it is.
The study that you did, is it public knowledge, the club that you worked with, or is that confidential?
We've never actually really listed it. I don't think it's particularly confidential so much as I think that the intention of it was that it could generalize to other groups, that it wasn't really specifically about that club. It was really just recognizing that if you collaborate with a group that you can sort of integrate what you're doing into the operations of a youth soccer club, that you could potentially have the same sort of outcomes and the same sort of relationships regardless of who it was.
Fair enough. Now, when I'm thinking about the fact that you used, again, well-being and sleep as just kind of one indicator that could lead to mental health, which then could lead to injuries and even worse, the S word, suicide, what are some key tipping points there to see, hey, that person's struggling with their well-being. Hey, that person clearly is very tired, fatigued.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's twofold. So we talk a lot about sort of instantiating these kind of monitoring programs so that you can identify people who have kind of a real dip from the norm, right? There are going to be people who have different levels of mood and stress and fatigue more generally, but when somebody really has a sort of precipitous or noticeable drop, there are ways that you can use that in order to initiate a conversation with them and identify what's really going on. And if you have these sorts of resources in place, then you just sort of serve as an individual who can help plug them in with what they really need. But again, I think maybe the biggest difference that we can make is within all of these sports contexts, if we just have conversations about mental health, right? When you meet with groups at the beginning of the season, for example, bring in a sports psychologist so that they can talk about it and deliver resources to people. As a club, you can hand out resources about mental health, and then individually within the training context, the same way that we have conversations with players about all sorts of things, we can bring up mental health issues so that it just makes it that much easier for them to come to us when they need something and don't otherwise know where to turn.
Action item again, if somebody is listening now and they're like, hey, I like that idea of getting a psychiatrist. I like the idea of having, little tipping points to keep an eye on our players, and they want a little bit more insight from you as the chief medical advisor. Are you accessible, or how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, what I did up here, I don't have much of a social media presence, but I sort of blasted my email on every screen that I could, and I've really just encouraged people to reach out. And since we finished up, I mean, I've had a lot of people just come up directly to talk about it. I know that the ECNL is tending to distribute, the slide deck from the presentation we got so that the things that I talked about are available to people. But beyond that, I really just encourage people to reach out and contact me. I think the easiest way is just through email, and then we take it from there.
How about that email?
Sure. So it's just my last name, Watson, Watson, and at ortho, ortho.wisc, wisc.edu.
We've already covered a lot of heavy and heady issues, and maybe this isn't fair, but since we don't always have this kind of access to you, I do want to talk about even suicide with high achievers. Seeing all the high achievers here, and even talking to Marguerite Awazasa, who was an assistant coach for Stanford before taking over for UCLA, made me think, of course, of Katie Meyer, a high achiever, like 4.0 student, world-class goalkeeper who hit a bump in the road and decided the best way to solve the problem was to take her life. And as you reflect on that, she's not the only one. Where do you put that as far as the bucket of the mental health epidemic, and what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously suicide is a huge tragedy, and I think what we need to get comfortable with is treating it the same way that we might if someone died from cancer, for example. I think the true shame is when we approach suicide as something different than a different disease and somehow make it more difficult to talk about, or somehow put some layer of shame around the act itself. People die of suicide. People die of heart attacks. What we need to be doing is approaching mental health the same way that we approach mental health in order to reduce the risk. This is going to be a pervasive problem for a long time, and the more we can build in operations that help get people the help that they need early, the more potentially we can help them before they do get in a position where they ultimately do die of suicide.
I'm big on last word. If people missed your presentation, if for some reason someone just tuned in right now and they know that we have the Chief Medical Advisor for the ECNL and Dr. Drew Watson, and your topic was injuries influence mental health. If you only had this one soundbite right here, right now to get your message across, here's your opportunity.
All right, Dean, I've got two. And the first is I would say that in my opinion, sports are perhaps the most impactful way that we have to improve the physical and mental health of children in our country. That's number one. But number two is that to me that isn't even the real true promise of sports. What's really on offer here is that it's perhaps the best way for kids to learn the lesson that if you really, really embrace doing hard things, if you really come to enjoy doing hard things, you can learn that the limits you think you have are imaginary. And you can realize that you have so many more options and possibilities that you thought that you did. This is why sports are such a big deal to me, such a big deal in my household, and why so many of us reflect on our time as athletes when we're younger and realize that the lessons we learned within youth sports affected our ability to go out and do things in all sorts of different areas.
That works for me. It's always great to spend time with you. Thanks for being with us here. Dr. Drew Watson, an incredible background, but for us, we love him as the Chief Medical Advisor for the ECNL and the fact that he also is out there coaching as well. Dr. Watson, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Dean. It's always my pleasure.